When he woke up, the protagonist saw an unfamiliar ceiling above him. The man looked at his hand. He didn't understand why he was lying in bed. He grabbed his head. Suddenly, a woman's voice nearby timidly asked if he was all right. A woman was sitting in front of him, tears in her eyes. She asked about his condition very timidly and plaintively. The man tried to sit up and didn't immediately realize that this woman was speaking to him. She looked at him fearfully and told him he shouldn't get up yet. The man replied indifferently that everything was fine. Strange, he had a very mature and rough voice, and that surprised him. He touched his face, his dark brown hair, and realized he had been reborn as a different person. The woman next to him was very frightened. His name is Karis Full. He is the head of the ducal house. The woman in front of him is his wife, Duchess Sasha Full. Together with their daughter, Larie, they are a family of 3. He understood. This was him from another life. He had lived in a completely different world, in Japan, where the concept of aristocracy seemed like a relic of the past. He grew up there and got a job as a clerk. And his name? Karis realized it was useless. He wouldn't be able to remember. The man clutched his head in frustration and let it go. And yet, there was one thing he remembered crystal clear. He remembered Pure Love Princess, your super flirty romance. It was a dating simulator for girls, a so-called Otome game. Karis didn't understand why that particular memory had surfaced, and he was sure there had to be at least something else. He stared into space. Sasha sat next to him, looking very tense, and tried to ask him something about his health and how he was feeling. Karis replied that everything was fine and called her name. Sasha reacted sharply and asked, "What happened?" She had a very sad expression on her face. The name Sasha slipped from Karis' lips without him meaning to. Judging by his memories, the woman in front of him was undoubtedly his wife, Sasha. Memories of 2 completely different lives were jumbled in his head. Karis had a strange feeling. What he knew for sure was intertwined with things he had no clue about. The man sat on the bed and realized he needed to sort everything out. Right now, he was in Karis' body, but he was thinking like a Japanese man. At the same time, he had memories of both. Considering all this, he was certain that only one thing best described his situation. As delusional as it might sound, reincarnation in another world. A classic trope. An ordinary office worker wakes up in the body of an attractive aristocrat. Karis noticed that his head had cleared and everything fell into place. Now he understood why Sasha was acting so stiff around him. He had thought she was simply worried about his health. But if he relied on the memories of the former Karis, their relationship had been, to put it mildly, frosty. More precisely, Karis himself hadn't shown the slightest interest in his wife. And then the man realized why Sasha was on pins and needles. The woman stood up and gently asked her husband if his headache was still bothering him. She asked if she could call a doctor for him. Karis assured her that everything was fine. He asked if he had lost consciousness. Sasha replied that the man must have been severely exhausted. She relayed the doctor's words to him, telling him that nothing serious had happened. She decided to sit with him just in case and asked anxiously if she was bothering him. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. Karis gently stroked her head, and he thanked Sasha for staying with him. He was happy that Sasha was his wife. The woman was startled and gaped in surprise. After all, she had never heard such words from her husband before. She tried to make an excuse out of habit, but Karis thought that was strange. And even if they didn't get along very well, they were still husband and wife. He didn't understand why she would be so embarrassed by a few kind words. A smile appeared on his face as if nothing had happened. If a husband who used to not even look her way suddenly showers her with compliments, it's no wonder she'd react that way. After all, the rift between them had arisen because of Karis's coldness toward women. But since he had tied the knot, he had to treat Sasha with respect. Now that Karis has become a man, he believes it is his duty to atone to his family for all the indifference of past years. Karis admits that he himself is surprised at how easily he has settled into his new role. The man turned to Sasha. She was startled and replied nervously. Karis stroked her hair and apologized for making her worry. Sasha asked in surprise, "Are you really not feeling well?" Karis replied in surprise, "Why do you assume I'm not feeling well right away?" Although the man understood that, considering what a scoundrel he used to be, his wife's reaction was understandable. He left the room and remembered that there was one more person he needed to check on urgently. In the memory of the former Karis, everything was a blur, but he remembered that they had a daughter who was turning for this year. An elderly man met him in the hallway. His name was Sieg and Karis remembered him. The man said he was just on his way to the master's quarters and asked Karis where he was going. Was he feeling better? Karis, without giving anything away, replied that he was feeling better now and that he was going to check on Laurier's daughter. Sieg was very surprised. He asked again, thinking he might have misheard. The protagonist replied to Sieg that his ears hadn't deceived him, scratching the back of his head awkwardly, and he asked if his daughter's room was in this wing. Sieg immediately apologized to him for his boldness. The protagonist understood that this shouldn't have been too surprising. Karis stood there looking a little displeased. Sieg tried to politely explain to Mr. Karis that Mrs. Laurier was currently in the middle of an etiquette lesson. Karis was learning more and more about his family now. He assured the footman that he would just peek in on his daughter. Sieg resigned himself to it. He let him pass, pointing to the large, light-colored door in front of him. Before stepping inside, Karis paused for a moment in front of the door and thought. He thanked Sieg for his help. Just as the man was about to knock on the door, he heard strange and angry shouts. Behind the door, his daughter was being harshly scolded and berated. They called her a worthless little thing. They asked how many times they had to hammer it into her head before she got it. Karis was greatly surprised. His eyes widened. He was horrified by what he heard. The girl was loudly called stupid, and in response, she only sincerely repented and wanted it to stop. They yelled at her that she was just as worthless as her parents and that she was a girl absolutely no one needed. The girl apologized again. The teacher yelled that no one at Laurier even wanted to look at her because she was one big disappointment. The girl cried and said that wasn't true. She couldn't find the words. She thought her parents had grown completely cold toward each other because of her. Karis didn't know if this applied to his memory or not. He clutched his head in anguish. That phrase was painfully familiar to him. Sieg stood behind him, trying to bring Karis to his senses. And the woman behind the door was yelling at the girl that deep down, she knew perfectly well that her parents didn't love her. Laurier burst into tears and thought that at least he should have loved her. Karis tensed. He remembered. The man burst into the room. He spread his arms and began to defend Laurier and yell at the teacher. He shouted that not only was she calling his daughter names, but she also dared to claim that no one wanted her and was hitting her with hatred and rage. He yelled and asked the woman what she was doing to his daughter. The girl covered her face with her hands. The woman turned around and was horrified by the man's sudden appearance. Laurier hadn't expected her father to come running at the sound of the screams. And Karis pointed his finger at Laurier and repeated his question to the woman. What was she doing to his daughter? The teacher immediately fell silent, put on a pitiful expression, and barely managed to say that she was merely teaching the young lady lessons in etiquette. Karis was filled with hatred for her. He saw the bruises on Laurier's body and asked where they came from. The woman began to make a ridiculous excuse and replied that the bruises were from the young lady tripping and falling. Karis replied that if she intended to keep taking him for a fool, that was her right. But now, by his order, she was fired. Karis ordered the unscrupulous governess not to show her face again. The woman immediately began to defend herself and asked him to listen to her. She explained that she had been forced to be strict with Laurier for the sake of her own upbringing. Karis angrily ordered her to shut up, because his house wasn't so shabby that it needed to keep such a talentless tutor. The man told her to stay away from his family, or else next time her own head would roll. He asked if she understood everything. Immediately, two maids approached and led the governess out of the house. Karis asked Sieg to make sure she was never seen on their estate again. Laurier was sitting on the floor. Karis rushed over to her and asked if she was all right. The man hugged his daughter and sincerely asked for her forgiveness. Because he had been such a lousy father, she had had to endure so much pain. The girl was surprised by her father's behavior. Karis assured her that everything would be fine now. Laurier said that she had been told that nobody needed her, that she was bad. And so the girl threw herself into his arms and began to sob. Karis carried her to the room and laid her on the bed so she could rest a bit and compose herself. He sat down on a chair next to her bed and began to reflect. The man was outraged at this mentor for raising a hand against such a little one. But no, Karis admits that what infuriates him even more is his own blindness. He couldn't understand how the Karis of the past could have failed to notice what was going on under his own roof. The man couldn't wrap his head around how anyone could treat their own family with such utter disregard. Just then, Sasha walked into the room and addressed Karis, once again calling him her master. But immediately she rushed over to Laurier and took her face in her hands. Sasha noticed that Laurier was covered in bruises and assumed it was because she had left her unattended. Karis stood beside her and told her that it wasn't just her fault, but his as well. Sasha began to cry. She replied that it was her fault. She explained that she had been thinking only of herself, and that if she had given her daughter more time and attention, this wouldn't have happened. Karis put his arm around her shoulders and gently asked her not to blame herself. He explained that all of this had happened because he had shut them out from the very beginning. Karis admitted that he had always been burdened by the fact that their marriage was a marriage of convenience. And because of that, he had been cold toward both Sasha and Laurier. But today, Karis realized just how foolish he had been. Feeling his wife's concern, the man discovered something completely new, and he sincerely swore that from now on, he would always be there for them. He touched Sasha on the shoulders and asked her to give him a chance to start over. His wife was even more surprised by this and didn't understand the meaning of his request. Karis understood that this all sounded too selfish to Sasha, and he agreed with that himself. But he suggested that together they give Laurier all their love so that such a nightmare would never happen again. He knelt down in front of her and took her hands. Karis told his wife that this wasn't just about parental duty. He turned to Sasha and said that, as a man, what he wanted more than anything in the world was to take care of her and be her rock. And he asked his wife to share all the joys, sorrows, and worries equally from now on, because he loved her more than life itself. A kind smile appeared on the man's face, and in Sasha's eyes, tears of sorrow gave way to tears of happiness. He lifted his wife into his arms, embraced her, and asked her to let him share this burden with her. And Sasha replied to her husband that she loved him very much. They wanted to kiss each other, but Sieg interrupted them. He barged into the room without knocking. But he immediately noticed that he had interrupted Sasha and Karis and suggested coming back later. Karis replied that everything was fine and asked to talk now and step out into the hallway. The men left the room to talk in private. Sieg said he wanted to talk about replacing the etiquette tutor whom Karis had just seen fit to fire. But Karis cut him off. He asked him if he knew that this woman had laid a hand on Larry. Sieg lowered his gaze and looked sad. He replied to the gentleman that he had suspected as much. Karis clutched his head and asked angrily why Sieg had kept quiet. The man replied that he had tried more than once to tell Karis about this. But as soon as he mentioned the name of young Miss Larry, Karis flatly refused to listen. Karis realized that this was entirely the fault of his past. Sieg added that, besides, the young lady herself had begged him not to say anything, because she was afraid of becoming a burden to Mr. Karis. And Sieg explained that there was nothing he could do about it. Karis was in shock. It made him sad that such a little girl was already trying so hard not to cause any trouble. The master asked if there had been similar incidents involving other teachers. Sieg replied that there hadn't been, and he believed that the only one who had let her hands run wild with Karis was the etiquette tutor. The footman handed Karis a list of all the other teachers. The man looked it over carefully. After that, Karis turned to Sieg and ordered that if any such trash were found among them, he should report it immediately. As for the new etiquette tutor, he asked Sieg not to worry because he would select a candidate himself later. Sieg obeyed him. He added that he had postponed all of Master Karis's matters that did not require urgent attention until tomorrow. Sieg kissed the gentleman's hand and advised him to spend the day with his wife and daughter. Karras replied that Sieg had been a great help to him today. Sieg realized that Mr. Karras had finally seen the light, and it was the greatest honor for him to serve him. Karras returned to the room. At that moment, Laurier opened her eyes and tried to say something. Her parents immediately rushed to her side. Karras wished her good morning and asked how she was feeling. Laurier replied, somewhat confused, that she was feeling fine. And the man was glad to hear that. He told his daughter she could just rest today. Laurier sat up in bed and asked what she should do about her studies today. Her father stroked her head and asked her not to worry about it for now. In the meantime, he told her that if anyone dared to hurt her again, she shouldn't hide anything from them anymore. The girl lowered her head. She began to stutter with fear and said that her teacher had told her her parents were very busy and had asked her not to get in the way. Karras heard this and realized that he really should have knocked that woman's head off. The man asked Laurier to listen to him. He said confidently that Laurier was their treasure, and she would never be a burden to them. So Karras allowed her from now on to rely on her parents and ask them for anything she wanted. But the girl was convinced that no one needed her, and she began to cry again, recalling the words of her former etiquette tutor. Karras replied that they needed her very much because they were a family, and he turned to Sasha, asking her to say something too and back him up. The woman hugged her daughter and asked for her forgiveness for not noticing her suffering for so long. Sasha realized that it sounded a little belated now, but she told her daughter that she was incredibly dear to her. Laurier looked her mother in the eyes and asked if it was true. Sasha replied that it was, because Laurier was her and her husband's treasure and beloved daughter. Laurier burst into tears. Sasha apologized again and hugged her tighter. Karras watched them and fell deep in thought. After all, not long ago, he had neither a wife nor a daughter. Before, he wouldn't have even dreamed of things like his daughter's marriage. And he certainly had never experienced such complex paternal feelings. But Karras was surprised at how easily he had accepted these feelings. And he thought that perhaps, deep down, the Karras of the past still felt like a husband and a father. Karras turned to his wife and daughter. He asked them to listen to him because he had a small suggestion for them. They were surprised by his words. Then the man thought for a moment and suggested that starting tomorrow, they all have dinner together and asked his family what they thought about it. He would now build their relationship step by step, starting with little things like this. Sasha replied that it sounded wonderful and agreed with her husband. Laurier was delighted and said she would be looking forward to it very, very much. But then she suddenly became embarrassed. Karras asked her not to be afraid and to say what she wanted. The girl grabbed the edge of the bed and started to get nervous. She turned to her father and mother and asked their permission to sleep with them tonight. Laurier didn't expect their approval because she still thought she was getting in their way. But her parents agreed right away. The girl was overjoyed and she asked them to read her a story. And Sasha replied that they would definitely read her one. And Laurier, overjoyed, ran off to get changed for bed. Karras understood that the past couldn't be rewritten, and yet they could build their own future. Starting today, they would begin writing their family's story with a clean slate. Time passed. Karras was sitting in his study. For the past few days, as Karras spent time with his family and his new body, he couldn't shake a strange premonition. He couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. But every time Karras looked at Laurier, something inside him tightened. The ducal house. All those aristocratic titles swirled around in Karras's head like clues, because his memories of his two lives had turned into a jumbled mess. His mind was clouded. But then it hit him. Laurier Full. He realized he knew that name from somewhere. I mean, obviously, she's his daughter. But that wasn't the point. It was as if he'd heard it in his past life, in a world without any aristocrats. Karras didn't understand what this awful feeling was. It seemed to him that if he dug just a little deeper, he would unearth some terrible truth. He thought about Laurier's words, that no one loved her anyway. Suddenly, Karras remembered. He hadn't believed it could be true. The fate of one doomed girl. The man realized he knew her ending. Now he remembered everything. Laurier is the villain. Pure love princess. Your super flirty romance. The name of the game that first popped into Karis's Japanese memory. In his past life in distant Japan, they released such girls' games. Dating simulators. And in one of them, there was a typical villainess who was always plotting against the main heroine and interfering with her love. And that villainess was named Laurier Foal. Karis didn't believe it. He thought that such coincidences simply didn't happen. And he realized that he was the father of that very villainess. The man had already started to reassure himself that perhaps it was just a similar world. But he immediately realized that it couldn't be that similar. On the other hand, he'd read manga where heroines were reincarnated as villains and tried to survive. They even broke flags of doom and all that stuff in those stories. Karis guessed that something similar might have happened to him. And anyway, he was sure that having memories from a past life was already wild enough on its own. But Karis knew that if that were really the case, his Laurier would become a villain. He wouldn't believe for a second that his sweet, angelic little daughter would turn into a villain. However, he didn't forget that God helps those who help themselves, and that it was better to nip all risk factors in the bud. He sat there, trying to remember what the plot was. A typical fairy tale love story between an aristocrat and a commoner. Laurier becomes the villain in the love story of the handsome prince. Karis thought she might still have a chance with her stepbrother. But since the family doesn't have any adopted children yet, the man doesn't need to worry about that. The main headache is the prince's route. But there's no talk of an engagement yet. Karis seemed to recall that there was a prince her age in the royal family. But besides them, there are other influential houses. So he was confident that this issue was unlikely to come up anytime soon. But Karis knew that the only thing that could ruin everything was if Laurier fell head over heels in love with the prince herself. Karis didn't know if she could fall in love with a guy she'd never even seen. But as far as he remembered the game, Laurier had a hopeless crush on the prince and, out of jealousy, constantly humiliated the main character. But her tantrums only brought them closer together. In the end, all of Laurier's schemes were exposed, and a predictable bad ending awaited her. This event, with the public breakup of the engagement, was the highlight of the prince's route. In the game, this remained off-screen. But the official artbook stated that after her expulsion, she wandered the streets and then, in some alleyway, fell victim to thugs and died. Karis was outraged by what a cruel, undeserved fate this was. But he understood that even if things did come to a bad ending, he would never in his life kick Laurier out of the house. The man thought for a moment and came to the conclusion that Laurier, in essence, wasn't to blame at all. Of course, he shouldn't have gone overboard with the teasing, but any girl would be furious if some upstart suddenly started hitting on her beloved fiancé. Karis understood that the real culprit here was this flighty prince who had started drooling over another woman right in front of his fiancée. If the prince turns out to be such a jerk, Karis would never give his precious daughter to him. And yet, if Laurier does genuinely fall in love with the prince, there's nothing to be done about it. Karis would be ready to do everything in his power to ensure her feelings were reciprocated. And if the prince started chasing after the heroine, the man would simply persuade Laurier to dump him first. But the most important thing, in the man's opinion, was something else entirely. Laurier grew up in a cold family, and that's why she tried so desperately to cling to crumbs of someone else's love. She smothered the prince with her dependence and, driven mad by jealousy, brought about her own tragic end. So Karis realized there was only one way out. He simply had to shower his family with love and make them truly happy. All genius is simple. For his wife's sake. For his daughter's sake. For the sake of peace in their home. Karis is ready to give them all his love and prevent a bad ending at all costs. The man sat in the kitchen, deeply absorbed in his thoughts. And this task turned out to be far more complicated than he'd imagined. He had already cursed everything because of the limited selection of ingredients in this world. Sugar here, as Karis realized, was an unaffordable luxury. The scale was terribly inconvenient, and there wasn't a cookie cutter in sight. But he still managed to make cookies shaped like seals. The man picked one up and looked at it. He realized that, of course, it was far from perfect, but at least it turned out to be quite decent by local standards. He tasted one cookie and noticed that it was actually delicious. But why on earth did Karis suddenly decide to become a baker? The man explained that it was all because he wanted to treat his beloved girls to some sweets. When little Laurier tasted the cookie, she was delighted and asked if her father had really made it himself. Sasha, overjoyed, praised her master and said it was incredibly delicious. Comparing the local pastries to what Karis remembered from his past life, the man came to one important conclusion. Just as he'd expected, getting high-quality ingredients in this backward world was quite the quest. There were no nuts, no cocoa, just strange snowballs and shortbread cookies. So Karis realized he wouldn't be able to get too creative with his recipes. At first, he figured he should at least give the cookies some kind of cute shape. And in the kitchen, he found something that looked like a cat-shaped cookie cutter. As Karis honestly admits, he himself feels a bit awkward about a big, grown man so diligently cutting out cute little faces on cookies. But for the sake of his loved ones, Karis was ready to endure even greater humiliation. Just then, a chef, a man wearing a tall chef's hat and sporting a beard, named Garlic, came into the kitchen. He asked if Mr. Karis was finished, and he replied that, generally speaking, everything was already ready. Garlic remarked that the man's food was beautifully cooked. He was surprised and asked Mr. Karis when he had learned to cook so well. Karis replied that he had simply practiced a bit in his spare time. He then asked Garlic to take a sample. The man didn't refuse, and with his permission, he tasted Mr. Karis' cookies. Of course, Karis couldn't admit that he knew how to bake only because of memories from a past life. He felt bad about pulling Garlic's leg, but he couldn't tell him the truth, so he resigned himself to it. Suddenly, Garlic felt sick. Karis was seriously scared. And then Garlic exclaimed that he begged the man to share the recipe for this miracle. Karis replied that he'd be happy to share it and asked how the cookies tasted. Garlic replied, surprised, that they were simply divine. But Karis noticed that the cook's face didn't seem to show any enjoyment at all. Garlic explained that the texture of these cookies was nothing like anything he'd tasted before. They were so light and crispy. As soon as he put one in his mouth, it literally began to melt, revealing an incredible flavor. The chef, in shock, asked Karis how he had managed to bake such a delicious treat. But the man still hadn't figured out what was wrong with his face. He thought it must be all about love, probably. Garlic said with a smile that the rumors were true. In his opinion, Mr. Karis had become like a different person lately. He cheered up and learned a joke. Karis was surprised and laughed at that, and he immediately realized what rumors were circulating about him around the estate. But he knew it was the absolute truth, so there was no other way to put it. Garlic apologized in advance to Mr. Karis for his rudeness, and he said that, in his opinion, the atmosphere in the mansion had indeed changed lately. Karis realized there was no arguing with that. Previously, the relationship between Karis, Duchess Sasha, and their daughter Laurier had been nothing short of disastrous. And because of that, it was hard for everyone in the house to breathe. But ever since a new man had taken over the body of the former Karis, he had begun to treat the servants simply and naturally. People had relaxed, and the atmosphere had gradually eased. But the main reason it's become easier to breathe in the mansion is that Karis has started treating his wife and daughter with such tenderness that it's simply impossible not to notice. At first, the servants stood there with their mouths agape, in surprise. Take Garlic, for example. When a new Karis first walked into the kitchen, they were all scared to death. But now, Karis believes the servants look at their family with a sincere smile. Exactly. Karis told Garlic that he'd like to ask him to prepare a special dish. And Garlic didn't refuse him, replying that he'd be more than happy to do it. The chef asked the master to tell him everything, not forgetting the recipe for those cookies. Karis laughed at the chef, saying he wouldn't let his chance slip away. He replied that he would be able to write everything down for him later. Garlic was very grateful to Master Karis, and the main character announced that he now wanted to invite his ladies for tea and left the kitchen. But just then, one of the maids approached Karis and told her, looking worried, that the young lady was currently in dance class. The man looked at the maid in surprise. Dancing was mandatory for aristocrats. He understood there was nothing to be done about it. And yet Karis was indignant that his daughter was already toiling on the dance floor at such a young age. He wanted to praise her properly. Karis asked the maid if his daughter had any more lessons scheduled for today. She replied nervously that Laurier only had dance lessons today and asked why he was asking. Karis asked the maid to tell Laurier to come to the courtyard as soon as she was finished, because they wanted to have a family tea party. The maid smiled and understood her master's request. She replied that she would certainly pass it on and that the young lady would be very pleased. Karis realized that having such a devoted maid by Laurier's side warmed his heart. After that incident, he checked on all the other teachers, dismissed everyone who behaved like that etiquette teacher, and completely cleaned up his daughter's surroundings. Servants who sincerely love their masters, in Karis's opinion, are worth their weight in gold, and such people definitely need to be cherished. He told the maid that he was counting on her, and he realized that Laurier would join them later. The man wanted to go right away and invite his second lady to tea. He walked into her room and apologized with a smile for his unexpected intrusion. But before him, he saw extraordinary beauty. Sasha was sitting at the table going about her business. Karis looked at her and noticed that Sasha was a girl who looked as if she had stepped out of a painting, and one could admire her forever. But he remembered they had plans, so he addressed her. The woman apologized to her master, and explained that she had become so engrossed in her work that she hadn't even noticed him. Karis apologized in return for barging in on her, without knocking. He told her that the maids had told him she was here in her room, doing some embroidery. That's why he decided to drop by. Karis moved closer to his wife and took a strand of her hair in his hands. He explained that he was so captivated by her that he had lost his ability to speak. Sasha was very embarrassed and blushed, thinking he was flattering her. But then Karis realized just how charming his wife was. He was ready to break into a silly grin. The man asked his wife gently what she had been working so hard on, and looked at the table. There lay an embroidery hoop with fabric on which flowers were embroidered. Karis praised his wife and said it was a very beautiful pattern. But Sasha blushed even more than before, and quietly said that she wanted to give this embroidery to Karis. Confused and frightened, she asked if it would cause him any inconvenience. Karis gently stroked her chin and asked what kind of inconvenience could there be. He replied that, of course, he was overjoyed to receive such a gift, because it was a gift from his beloved wife, and looked into her eyes with tenderness. Her cheeks flushed a burgundy red with embarrassment. But then Sasha asked Mr. Karis what had brought him to her, and Karis remembered his business. The man told her that he wanted to suggest the three of them have tea together once Laurier finished her dance lesson, and asked his wife's opinion. The woman replied that she would be only too happy, and smiled sweetly at him. Karis replied that that was wonderful, and that they still had a little time left. So an idea came to him. He asked his wife for permission to sit with her, and watch her embroider until Laurier was free. Sasha smiled sweetly, and gave her husband permission. The man considered it a blessing that it was daytime, because, in his opinion, if it had been evening, they would have gone too far. A short while later, little Laurier ran into the room, and was overjoyed to see her father and mother. Karis took her by the hands, called her a clever girl, praised her, and asked if her dance class was over. The girl replied to her father that it was, and she was praised once more. Laurier turned to her mother, and told her that today her dance teacher had praised her for her turns. Sasha smiled, and asked her daughter to be sure to show her those praised turns later. Karis watched them, and, smiling, was convinced once again that his wife and daughter were the best in the world. The man turned to Sasha. He whispered in her ear that he'd like to run his fingers through her hair too, but he'd wait until they were alone. The woman blushed and looked embarrassed. Karis laughed playfully at her. Laurier smiled. Karis cheerfully picked up his daughter, and invited her to sit down at the table and start drinking tea. The girl was very happy. Plates of Karis cookies and other treats were already on the table. Sasha and Laurier's mouths dropped open in surprise, and they were delighted to see such a variety of desserts on the table. Karis explained that he had decided to try his hand at baking cookies. He asked his two ladies to taste them and give their opinion on how they tasted. Sasha was even more surprised, and asked her husband if he had really made all of this himself. The man replied that it was exactly as she said. He had baked the cookies with love, especially for the two of them, so he really hoped they would like them. Karis invited them to help themselves, and mentioned that he had made them a little sweeter for Laurier. And for Sasha, he had tried to make the flavor more delicate. He hoped she would like them too. His wife remarked that he had gone to such great lengths just for her and Laurier. Karis smiled. He told his wife that he just wanted to treat them to something delicious, so it was a pleasure for him. Sasha wanted to thank him sincerely and Laurier too, but Karis told them to at least try the cookies first so they wouldn't just talk about them. And they began to eat. Karis tensed up a little because he wanted the cookies to be perfect, and for the family to like them. Laurier told her father that the cookies were sweet and very tasty, and Sasha said with a smile that they just melted in your mouth. Karis picked up his cup of tea, took a sip, and replied, relaxing, that he was very happy. Sasha asked if he was going to eat any himself. The man was embarrassed. He replied that just seeing how much they were enjoying them was enough to satisfy him. Sasha and Laurier exchanged questioning glances, and probably suspected something was wrong. Karis tensed up again. His daughter turned to him. She picked up a cookie and asked her father to open his mouth. Karis's heart began to pound. He couldn't even imagine that his own daughter would ever feed him from her hand. And then Sasha did the same thing, taking a cookie and asking her husband to eat it. Karis's heart pounded even harder. His charming wife and daughter were feeding him. He had never been so happy to be reborn as Karis. In that case, the man told the ladies that he would gladly accept this treat from them. He ate the 2 cookies and was very pleased. His daughter asked if he liked them, and Karis replied that the cookies were simply overflowing with their love. Sasha and Laurier smiled at each other, and realized they had managed to make the head of the family happy. Suddenly, the girl blushed, laughed, and covered her face with her hand in embarrassment. Sasha asked her what was wrong, and Laurier replied that eating delicious cookies together was one big joy. The parents were delighted and told her that it really was true happiness. Karis then suggested that they bake these cookies together next time. Sasha smiled and replied that it sounded wonderful. The girl waved her arms with joy, and they all continued to chat, talk, drink tea, and eat the delicious cookies. To ensure those smiles never faded, Karis was ready to give them even more of his boundless love from now on. Little Laurier and her father, Karis Foal, are riding in a large carriage, seated on luxurious leather seats. Laurier turns to her father with fear and anxiety in her eyes. Karis reassures her that everything will be fine, and that she just needs to act naturally. But the girl replied that this was her first time going to the palace. Karis smiled, realizing that his daughter was only 4 years old, and that it was rather silly of him to ask her not to worry. Today, the palace is celebrating the birthday of Serena, the second princess of their kingdom. Usually, the children of aristocrats make their official debut shortly after turning 5. But Karis explains that this time the format is special. Only young ladies the same age as the princess are invited, accompanied by their parents. For the royal family, this is an opportunity to find friends for Serena. And for the aristocrats, it's a chance to forge useful connections, should their daughters find favor at court. And if a family has sons, there's a faint hope of someday becoming related to the monarchs. But Karis admits that he just wants Laurier to have fun at the party, without thinking about the adults' hidden motives. Of course, he believes that showing disrespect to the princess is unacceptable. He turned to his daughter. The man told her that if she remembered everything she had learned, and behaved as usual, everything would go wonderfully. But Laurier replied anxiously that she was from the ducal house of Full, and, in her opinion, had to behave impeccably. Karis couldn't believe that such words were coming from a child who wasn't even 5 years old yet. He told Laurier that she really didn't need to put so much pressure on herself. Karis asked her to try to befriend Princess Serena, but he immediately warned his daughter that if, for whatever reason, she couldn't become friends with her, it would be enough to simply greet her politely. Karis added that, of course, their family status was important. But in his opinion, the most important thing was for his sweet Laurier to remain true to herself. The girl clenched her fists and fidgeted with the folds of fabric on her dress out of fear and nervousness. The man continued speaking and reassured her that there was no greater joy for him than seeing Laurier remain the same kind and sensitive girl she always was. He stroked her shoulders and thought for a moment what a lovely daughter he had. Karis's eyes sparkled. He believes that, perhaps as the head of the ducal house, he should be striving more actively for power. But the man understood that, personally, he could not fixate solely on politics. Of course, for an aristocrat, the continuation of his aristocratic lineage is of the utmost importance. But Karis wants to leave a secure legacy for Laurier and their future children if he and Sasha have any. Above all, however, Karis wishes for the happiness of Sasha, Laurier, and their entire growing family. In high society, where connections are everything, he believes it's important to be able to adapt even to the most unpleasant people. But his fatherly heart strongly objects to Laurier having to force herself. Of course, in Karis's opinion, she needs this kind of experience. And he understands perfectly well that in the world of the aristocracy, such situations are unavoidable. But Karis would prefer there to be as few of those as possible, because Laurier shouldn't have to suppress her own feelings for the sake of her family. Laurier had already been carrying that unbearable burden of responsibility all alone for far too long. Karis thought about this as he sat next to his daughter, stroking her head and speaking to her. He told Laurier that she was a very kind and smart girl, and that was why she kept so much to herself. And so he told her that she could safely rely on him and her mother. The girl began fiddling with the fabric of her dress again to keep her hands busy and replied guiltily that she and her mother were very busy. Karis had only one thought in his mind. Finding time for one child is every parent's sacred duty. He looked at his daughter with pity in his eyes, and he told the girl that she was the most precious daughter to him and Sasha. The man took her hands and promised not to let go until they reached the hall, so Laurier could stop worrying now. She looked at her father with devotion and calmed down a little. The girl noticed that her father's hand was very large and reassuring. Karis was slightly surprised by this and laughed at her words, and they drove on. And so, after some time, Karis and Laurier arrived at the palace. When they entered the royal garden, they were not greeted very warmly or cheerfully. All the guests were greatly surprised that Duke Fol had come to such an event because it was so rare to see him at such social gatherings. People guessed that, therefore, the young lady standing next to him must be his daughter. High society is full of extremely tedious rules, or rather, unspoken laws and strict etiquette. For example, speaking first to someone of higher status is considered bad form. One must remain silent until spoken to. Karis knew that impeccable adherence to these subtleties was, apparently, what defined true nobility. In his former world, such rules didn't exist. So now Karis found it difficult to grasp, because in Japan it's the opposite. The junior in status must greet the senior first, introduce oneself and bow. But whatever the case, Karis was obliged to uphold the reputation of the former Karis, a man who had lived his entire life as a true aristocrat. For the sake of Sasha and Laurier's well-being, he was ready to cast aside all doubts and play this role flawlessly. The man walked beside his daughter, greeting all the guests warmly and openly. The girl also greeted everyone, curtsying and introducing herself as Laurierful. Karis noticed that Laurier, though a little shy of all this high society, was handling the greetings brilliantly, just as befits a true lady. The man noticed that his daughter apparently had a natural talent for this, despite the fact that she had ended up with a simply dreadful etiquette tutor. The girl truly behaved with dignity toward the guests, conversed politely and gracefully, always thanking and respecting everyone. Laurier was still so young, yet she already carried herself with the dignity of a true duke's daughter. Karis was simply speechless. He thought Laurier was simply a real angel. Meanwhile, all the guests were informed that His Majesty the King and Second Princess Serena had arrived. All the servants and guests present immediately bowed low to the floor. The king addressed everyone and thanked them for accepting their invitation. Today they were celebrating his daughter Serena's 8th birthday. The king, concluding his speech, sincerely wished all the guests a wonderful evening. Everyone clapped in unison, and then he suddenly approached and addressed Duke Foal. The king told the man that he was pleased that Karis Foal had honored them all with his presence today. The duke replied to the king that he was glad to meet him, and Karis recalled how he had thought to himself that status wasn't all that important to him. But his family stood at the very top of the aristocratic hierarchy. Karis addressed Princess Serena with respect and deference and offered her his sincere holiday greetings. The girl thanked Duke Foal. Karis asked the king and princess for permission to introduce his precious and beloved daughter, Laurier Foal. At that moment, the girl made a graceful curtsy and thanked them for inviting her to the celebration. Meanwhile, Karis silently praised his daughter, thinking that her words of thanks, accompanied by the curtsy, sounded and looked absolutely perfect. But suddenly the king made a rather displeased face. Karis noticed this and, turning to his majesty, asked him if everything was all right. And then the king replied that it was not. With a disgusted smile, he explained that he was merely slightly surprised by the incredible tenderness with which Duke Foal looked at his daughter. He asked Karis not to take this as a lack of tact, but the king had never before had the impression that Karis Foal cared about his family at all. The man realized that even the king himself knew about the coldness of the former Karis. He honestly replied to the king that he should be burning with shame, for that had indeed been the case in the past. However, Foal explained that now he loved his daughter with all his heart. He added that, of course, this applied fully to his wife as well. They were his most beloved and dearest wife and daughter. The king was surprised by this and replied that he hoped Laurier Foal and Princess Serena would be able to become friends, and he was counting on the young Lady Laurier. The girl was delighted by this. His Majesty and the second princess were about to leave and said before they went that they would speak with Foal a little later. But suddenly Serena turned around and ran over to Laurier. The girls took each other's hands, smiled at one another, and Serena invited Laurier to have tea with her sometime. Laurier was a little flustered from the excitement of talking to Princess Serena, but she agreed. Suddenly, Serena glanced briefly at Karis. Their eyes met and Karis felt a little uneasy. The king called his daughter over and Karis and Laurier were left alone. The girl asked her father nervously if she had greeted the members of the royal family correctly. Out of nervousness, she clutched her dress in her hands. Karis leaned toward her, gently patted his daughter on the head, and replied that she had done a great job. He told her that when they got home, he would definitely make her something very tasty as a reward. Laurier smiled and was very happy. Her father took her by the hand and reassured her that they didn't have much longer to go. After a while, they returned home. As soon as they walked in, Laurier ran to her mother, turned to her, and happily shouted that they were home. She hugged her mother. Sasha congratulated her dear husband and daughter on their return. Karis thanked his wife for always being there to greet them. The man said with kindness and tenderness that Sasha's smile was the first thing he saw upon returning home, and it instantly gave him strength. With tears of happiness in her eyes, the woman replied to her husband that she was actually incredibly lucky because now she could always greet them like this. Karis remarked how pleasant it was for him to hear such words and considered his wife a true angel. Laurier gently reminded her father about the treats. Karis told her that he remembered everything and would take care of the sweets right away. He asked his daughter to wait just a little bit and the girl agreed. Sasha turned to her husband and asked in surprise if he was really going to start cooking right now. She figured he must be very tired after the royal family celebration. In response, Karis picked up Laurier and cheerfully exclaimed that this was a well-deserved reward for his sweet daughter, and it was a joy for him. He smiled at his wife and daughter and winked at them. Sasha smiled sweetly in return. Karis turned to her and said that as soon as dessert was ready, they would have tea together, and he wanted to tell her as soon as possible what a lovely lady their sweet Laurier had been today. The little girl was very happy about this, and Sasha was happy too. And so, Karis went to the kitchen and was fully ready to cook. He thought for a moment and decided he needed to make something light and quick so as not to keep his girls waiting, and he wanted to use a recipe he had recently tried. He picked up a bowl and a whisk, He began mixing the prepared ingredients. The man placed the cookies he had baked last time into a baking dish and poured the mixture over them. After a while, he put it in the oven, let it cool a bit, arranged it nicely, and the dish was ready. He considers this an excellent and quick recipe for a delicious treat. Of course, he would have liked to use more sophisticated ingredients, but he realized there was nothing he could do about it. He had to make the best of what he had and just experiment. Suddenly, Sieg walked into the kitchen. The man noticed that Mr. Karras was here as usual, and he was surprised that he had barely returned and had already started cooking. Karras asked Sieg how he had guessed that he was here, to which the servant replied with a smile that the kitchen had practically become his second office. And Karras remembered that Sieg, at first, had been very surprised by this. Then the servant turned to him and said he had an urgent matter to discuss with his master. He asked Karras if he was very busy right now, to which the man replied that everything was fine and asked what had happened, and Sieg began to speak. It turned out that an invitation to a tea party from second Princess Serena had just been delivered, addressed to the young Lady Laurier. Karras asked again, and was surprised that the invitation was from Princess Serena herself. The seal on the letter undoubtedly belonged to the royal family, and it was addressed personally to Laurier. But he found it strange that it had all happened so quickly, and that, apparently, the messenger had been sent immediately after the reception. Such efficiency led Karras to suspect that everything had been planned in advance, or that he was being paranoid. Sieg asked anxiously what he should do, to which Karras replied seriously that he would speak with Laurier himself. If she flatly refused, he would fight tooth and nail, but he would decline the invitation. Although, Karras noted, to be honest, it was practically impossible to refuse a personal request from the princess. But first, it was important for the man to know what Laurier actually wanted. Then, after Sasha had finished baking the cookies, Karras and Laurier gathered around the table. The man apologized to the ladies for making them wait. Laurier asked her dad if the cookies were ready yet, and Sasha apologized in response, since her husband always takes on so much trouble. She sat at the table, looking rather restless. But Karras replied calmly that he did it all simply because it brought him joy. Sasha warmly thanked him for everything. Their treat was right in front of them, and Karras realized what it was. It was a cheesecake. Little Laurier was surprised and asked, "Do they make sweets out of cheese?" In this world, cheese desserts are almost unheard of, so the man knew her reaction was perfectly natural. He asked them to try it. Sasha thanked the gentleman once again for the treat. His daughter exclaimed that the dessert was incredibly delicious, and Karras' wife agreed, saying it was simply delicious. The man was glad his family liked it. Yes, in his opinion, it turned out pretty well. But since he remembers the original taste from his past life perfectly well, he understands that he still has room for improvement. And yet, since this dessert brings such happy smiles, it means it was a complete success. And then Karras remembered the letter. He turned to his daughter and told her that an invitation to a tea party from second Princess Serena had arrived in her name. The girl was even surprised. Sasha was too, and she reminded them that they had only met today. The woman was surprised that she and Princess Serena had become such good friends so quickly. Karras told the girl that if she didn't want to go, he wouldn't force her and asked for her opinion. After thinking for a moment, Laurier made up her mind and replied that she would go, because she really wanted to spend time with the princess too. Karras picked up his cup of tea and was happy for his daughter. He told her that since she was going, she should try to have a good time there. The girl laughed, and she turned to her father with a request. She asked for permission to take his sweets for Princess Serena. Karras replied that he didn't mind and asked in surprise, where did that idea suddenly come from? She replied with a smile that his desserts tasted like true happiness, and the girl wanted as many people as possible to try them. The man was delighted and once again thought of his daughter as an angel. He told his daughter that since she was going to take the treats to the palace, he would try to make something truly delicious. He just asked her not to force the princess to eat if she didn't want to. Laurier told her dad that everything would be fine. After all, his sweets were the very best. They hugged each other affectionately. Sasha chimed in, saying that her husband's desserts were truly magnificent and Princess Serena would certainly be delighted. And yet, Karis was convinced that his wife and daughter were incredibly charming. But he began to wonder. Homemade sweets for members of the royal family. The man was certain that he would have to outdo himself so that his daughter wouldn't be embarrassed. And yet, this Princess Serena, in Karis's opinion, is a rather curious character. And he only hopes that she won't cause his daughter any harm. Laurier arrived at the royal palace for tea with Princess Serena. Her father accompanied her and saw her off. Laurier sincerely and joyfully thanked her father for coming with her. But Karis was quite concerned and worried about his daughter's well-being. He asked her if she was absolutely sure she could manage on her own there. Laurier replied that she was sure, explaining that the place was full of maids and if anything happened, they would show her the way. Besides, Laurier added there were plenty of other royal children there. Plus, she had the sweets Karis had prepared for her. So the girl was sure everything would be fine. The man was touched and once again believed that his daughter was a true angel. He smiled at her and was moved. He ruffled her hair and replied that, in that case, they would go home together. The girl was delighted too. Karis wished her a wonderful time at Princess Serena's tea party. Laurier held the wrapped cheesecake from her dad in her hands and was delighted. A maid took her away and as she said goodbye, Laurier wished her father all the best at work today. Karis waved at her and smiled. He didn't know how to put it into words, but he felt that children grew by the hour, not by the day. And that was absolutely true. And the man began to recall that just a short while ago, Laurier could only manage a forced smile. Of course, Karis was genuinely happy that she now smiled so sincerely and warmly. But his daughter was growing up, which meant she was inevitably drifting away from her parents. And that made Karis feel a little sad. He probably realized that this is exactly how all children grow up. His fatherly heart wouldn't be able to bear it when she found her true love and got married. At her wedding, Karis was certain he would be weeping his eyes out. He thought about this as he stood in the middle of the royal courtyard. The man began to look very frightened and worried, and those around him noticed. Maids and other guests at the royal court began to approach him and ask Duke Foal if he was all right. Was he in pain? And then Karis realized that it was time for him to take care of his own business. After a while, he finally finished his business. The man looked very tired and worn out. But he had managed to finish much faster than he had expected. And he didn't understand why aristocrats had so much red tape to deal with. Karis wondered what he should do now. But his mind was on something else entirely. He was very worried about his daughter. And he thought that Laurier was probably still at the tea party. Suddenly, Karis decided to pass the time, take his mind off things, and take a walk through the garden. As one would expect from a royal palace, the garden, according to Karis' observations, was in perfect condition. The man noticed that it was very quiet here, and he considered the royal garden to be the perfect place for a stroll. Suddenly, Karis heard some noise and screams coming from the bushes nearby. He noticed a pair of children's legs sticking out of the bushes. Karis decided to go closer and see what was going on. And there he found a little boy. According to Karis' observations, this boy was about the same age as Laurier or slightly older. In his opinion, a commoner had no business being in the royal garden and had no way of getting there. So the boy was surely one of the aristocrats. A thought crossed Karis' mind. If you don't bother an aristocrat, he won't bother you. But he realized that this certainly didn't apply to children. The boy was sitting on the grass, his face buried in his knees, and his eyes closed. He was clearly sad. Karis addressed him and, in a concerned voice, asked him not to sit on the ground because he might get his clothes dirty that way. The boy looked up at Karis with his big, sad eyes. It was as if a light bulb went off in the man's head. It seemed to him that they had met somewhere before. But suddenly the boy said quietly that it didn't make any difference. Karis' expression turned very frightened. The boy rested his head on his knees again and continued in a sad, mournful voice that no one needed him anyway, and that his father had plenty to be proud of even without him. Karis sat down next to him and began to comfort him. The man said he didn't know what had happened between them and asked the boy, Aren't you the only one and only to your father? The stranger looked up at Karis again and asked what he meant. Karis replied that children are a true treasure to their parents, and no matter how many they have, every child is infinitely precious to them. The boy began to stutter with sadness and tears. He told Karis that no matter what he tried to do, everything always fell apart. People told him he was good for nothing because he couldn't measure up to his older brother. Karis felt very sorry for the boy. The man turned to him and replied with a smile that he didn't have to be an exact copy of his older brother. The boy lifted his head again and asked Karis in surprise what he thought. The protagonist replied that he wasn't his older brother and that it was perfectly natural that he couldn't do everything exactly like his older brother. The man replied that he was himself and that the boy needed to find his own talent, something that only he could do. The boy repeated those words. Karis believes that only this boy can figure out what that will be. He still has plenty of time ahead of him to learn, gain experience, and find his own path. The boy smiled slightly through his tears and asked Karis if he really thought he could do it. Karis patted the boy on the head and replied that he was absolutely certain of it. The man asked the boy if it was true that he had such a wonderful older brother. Karis's eyes were filled with endless and boundless kindness and care. He told the boy that he was certain he would be able to reach heights just as great. The boy carefully and nervously got off on the ground. He told Karis that he would definitely try to do so and sincerely thank him for his support. Karis warmly wished this stranger good luck and was glad to have spoken with him. But it was already time for him to go. The man also got up from the ground and went about his business. But suddenly, just as he was leaving, the boy called out to him, stopping him. And he called out asking if he could know his name. Karis was even a little taken aback. But he introduced himself warmly and cheerfully. The boy realized that this was none other than Mr. Karis himself. Meanwhile, Karis was interested in only one thing. Where was his precious and beloved daughter right now? At that moment, a group of 5 girls was standing in the nearby royal garden, among whom were Laurier and Serena. They were chatting cheerfully, joking with one another, and laughing carefree. Almost immediately, Laurier spotted her father and turned toward him. Then she immediately ran up to him with joyful shouts. They embraced warmly. Karis asked her if their tea party was over yet. The girl replied that it had and asked her father if he was free now. He also replied that he was. Today he had managed to get everything done early. But the man added that it was all trivial and asked the most important and pressing question. Had Laurier enjoyed the tea party? His daughter replied with delight and joy that yes, she had liked it, and it had been very, very fun. Just then, Princess Serena approached them. She graciously said she was pleased to meet Duke Full. The man replied that he thanked her for inviting his daughter here today. Serena said that she was the one who should thank him, because she and Laurier had had a wonderful time together. Karis was surprised by such elegance and was already beginning to doubt that this princess was only 8 years old. For some reason, he noticed that he found it incredibly difficult to communicate with her. The man replied to the princess that he was glad to hear that. Serena said that the sweets prepared by Duke Full were simply delicious. She asked if he had really made them himself. Karis replied that he had and asked if everything was all right with them. Serena replied that, without exaggeration, they were amazing. She politely asked if it wasn't too much trouble, he could make them for her again. The man smiled and replied that he could any time she wished. In that case, Serena told him that she would pay a visit to his estate next week and she would very much like to taste this delicacy again. It was that awkward moment when simple politeness turned into an actual visit. Karis replied to the princess that they would be eagerly awaiting her. Serena turned to Laurier and told her in a cheerful voice that they would see each other next week and was ready to say goodbye. Laurier replied that she thanked Princess Serena for this wonderful day. Suddenly, the princess turned to Karis again and asked if she could whisper something in his ear. The man was surprised but agreed. Serena moved closer to him and whispered quietly that she would like to speak with him in private next week. So she asked Dukeful to set aside some time for her. He asked anxiously why does she need to do that, and then Serena uttered a strange phrase, that he was a time traveler who had retained memories of his past life. and she quickly ran off, waving goodbye to them. Karis froze. He didn't immediately understand what the girl had just said to him, but he began to suspect that the princess had figured him out. Laurier noticed that her father was acting strangely. She asked him if everything was all right. Karis, not wanting to worry his daughter, told her that everything was fine, but he knew that wouldn't work. After all, making his daughter worry was unforgivable for a father. He leaned toward her and asked if she and Princess Serena had become friends. The girl replied that yes, they had become friends and had discussed a great many things. Karis said he was glad to hear that, but he couldn't get Serena's words out of his head. He told his daughter that Princess Serena would be coming to visit them next week, and he asked what had she been talking about. Laurier explained that Serena had asked her how well she got along with her mother, and also about sweets. Karis thought about it and noted that there didn't seem to be anything surprising or suspicious. And so far, in his opinion, it didn't seem like Serena meant Laurier any harm. That reassured him a little. He decided he shouldn't get himself worked up just yet, so that Laurier wouldn't suspect anything or worry. After that, Karis told Laurier that he would try to make a special dessert for a visit next week. The girl was very happy about that. Princess Serena still aroused Karis's suspicions. But since his daughter Laurier was so happy, he decided not to sound the alarm just yet. After a while, they returned home, and, as usual, Sasha greeted them. She was shocked that Princess Serena was coming to visit them. Lately, in Karis's opinion, Sasha had become very open about expressing her feelings. The man told his wife that it seemed Laurier had become friends with Princess Serena surprisingly quickly. Sasha was even more horrified and covered her mouth with her hand. But Karis was delighted and added that it seemed their beloved daughter was growing up to be a very sociable girl. And he laughed at that. He believed that Laurier is just as kind as Sasha, and that it's no surprise that people are drawn to her. His wife replied that her heart is nowhere near as pure as her daughter's, and she blushed. Karis suddenly took his wife's hand and looked at her. The man told his wife that she had the kindest heart of anyone he knew, but the woman looked down sadly. She replied that he was wrong, and that she had always thought only of herself. She had once desperately wanted Karis to pay her even a little attention, and in pursuit of that selfish desire, she had completely forgotten about their own daughter. Karis was deeply moved. Sasha went on to say that their daughter Laurier, despite everything, had found the strength to forgive her. That is why Sasha believes Laurier has the purest heart in the world. Karis put his arm around his wife in a gesture of support and replied that he was partly to blame, asking her not to blame herself. In fact, he was the one most to blame, since he was the one who had treated them both so dismissively. So Karis told his wife that he swore to give them twice as much of his love from now on, and wanted her to always be by his side. The man confessed to Sasha that he loved her more than anything in the world. Sasha also said that she had always loved Karis with all her heart, and was glad they had met. The following week, Princess Serena arrived at Duke Foal's estate. They met in his study, and Karis told her he was glad to welcome her. Serena, as if nothing had happened, told the man that he had a truly wonderful study. Karis replied that, as far as he knew, Serena was currently scheduled to have tea with Laurier, and he asked the princess what had brought her here. The girl replied, and asked if Karis didn't think it was tactless to ask such a question of a lady who had come to visit a gentleman. Karis didn't take the insult lying down, and replied that if she were a true lady, she wouldn't have barged into a stranger's study without asking. He stood up from the desk. He added that, with all due respect to her title, these walls held the secrets of the ducal house, so Karis politely asked her to refrain from such visits in the future. Serena replied that he was very cold, and was a little indignant, but didn't make much of it. She told Karis that it was a trivial matter, so she would ask directly. The man tensed. Princess Serena asked Duke Foal if he truly remembered his past life in another world. Karis's gaze went blank, and even looked a little frightened. Karis cleared his throat, and began to wonder whether he should tell the truth, or not. But he noticed that, judging by the girl's expression, she had already figured everything out. He asked her sternly, "Since you're asking, does that mean you have no doubts?" Serena sat down solemnly on the sofa in the man's office. She replied that, first of all, something strange had happened to Karis as well. And recently he had fallen and hit his head, and after that, his relationship with his family had miraculously improved. Serena thought that anyone in this situation would suspect something was wrong. Karis realized that this sounded quite logical. But he also realized that if he just kept defending himself, she would continue to dictate her terms. And so, Karis replied to the princess that she herself seemed to possess knowledge from a past life. Serena laughed, and replied that she adored men who were quick on the uptake, and that, if he didn't have a wife, she would have asked him to marry her herself. Karis laughed, and said that was a great joke. To which Serena replied that yes, it really was a joke. And she was glad that Mr. Karis had finally relaxed. Loom in sight. He scratched the back of his head and realized he'd panicked for nothing after all. And he said that you can't hide anything from Princess Serena. But he asked her to let him say just one thing. Whether he was joking or serious, Sasha would always be his one and only wife. Karis placed his hand over his heart and truly meant every word he said. Princess Serena even laughed a little at Karis's intense seriousness. She realized that the rumors about Mr. Foal being madly in love with his wife were absolutely true. Karis explained that he simply couldn't see anyone else by his side but Sasha. But he anxiously asked her what happens next. After all, in Karis's opinion, she had come here not only to confirm that he was from another world. The princess replied that he was right, and she explained that the villain's father, who had retained his memories of a past life, was such an unprecedented case that it was impossible to resist. The girl asked, wasn't that reason enough for her to come and see it for herself? Karis noticed that Serena had just called him the villain's father, and considering that she remembers everything too, that means the girl also knows the plot of this Otome game. Serena replied that she had suspected as much, and she realized that Mr. Foal was familiar with it as well. The game Pure Love Princess, your super flirty romance. Serena admitted that she hadn't thought man played games like that. She jokingly suggested that in a past life, Karis had been a woman. But Karis replied that he was afraid he'd have to disappoint her. In a past life he had, after all, been a man. The princess said she wouldn't interrogate him, but she would draw her own conclusions. To which Karis replied seriously that he would be grateful if she refrained from doing that as well. Serena asked them to put the jokes aside and said that everything was now crystal clear to her. In her opinion, since Mr. Karis knew the plot of the game, the changes in Laurier's character were entirely understandable. As far as Serena could recall, in the original story, Laurier had been an insufferably proud girl from a very young age. That was precisely why Laurier's sincere childlike innocence had so struck Princess Serena last time. Apparently, Karis thought that if Laurier had continued to suffer bullying from that etiquette teacher, and on top of that, had grown up in a family where her parents were constantly fighting, she would definitely have turned into a villain. Arrogance is merely the flip side of vulnerability, a defense mechanism that Laurier had to develop. Karis realized that if he had been even a moment late with his rebirth, he might not have been able to save Laurier from her destructive path. As soon as he thinks about it, his heart immediately bleeds for the Laurier from the game. But he was certain that his current Laurier was growing up to be a true little angel. So he was doing everything right. And then Serena spoke up again. She mentioned that, in her opinion, the sweets Mr. Foal had served at the tea party were completely out of place in this world. Karis realized what was going on. It turned out that, to someone in the know, these desserts would indeed have raised suspicions. Suddenly, Serena announced that she had come here to thank Karis Foal. The man didn't understand. He said he had absolutely no idea what he was supposed to be thanked for. Karis asked what gratitude she was referring to. Serena was surprised that Karis hadn't figured out himself. The man scratched the back of his head in confusion. He replied that, whether he guessed or not, he had no idea what she was talking about. And Serena declared that it was about her younger brother. At this point, Karis still hadn't begun to figure it out. The princess's younger brother, it turned out, was a prince. He didn't understand what that had to do with him. And Serena explained to the man that this was the very same boy he had spoken with last week in the royal garden by the flower bed. Karis realized that the princess was talking about that very same fair-haired boy, and it turned out to be her brother. The second prince, Suryu, one of the main love interests in the Otome game. Karis jumped to his feet and asked the princess in surprise what she had just said. Serena explained once more that she was talking about Suryu, the main character of the route in which Larier plays the villain. That guy by the flowerbed turned out to be the princess's younger brother and the game's main character. Karis couldn't wrap his head around it. He was very surprised and even scared. How was he supposed to know since he'd only seen artwork where he was an adult? Serena confessed and told him what had happened between her and her brother the other day. A strange story. One fine day, he approached his sister and told her he wanted to ask her something. He asked about the father of the girl who had recently come to the princess's tea party. Suryu asked his sister if she happened to know a gentleman named Karis. Serena smiled at her brother and asked, "What about Mr. Karis?" And then her brother began to tell her what the matter was. So Serena told the man that her brother had said he would very much like to thank Mr. Karis. The princess admitted that she was deeply moved. She had thought that Karis had shown him kindness knowing that the second prince was an important character in the game. But as it turned out, the man had done it from the bottom of his heart. Karis admitted to Princess Serena that, to be honest, he couldn't remember the prince's appearance at all. He figured that since the boy was wandering around the castle, he must be the child of one of the nobles. But still, the man didn't understand what he was being thanked for. After all, they had only exchanged a few words in the garden back then, and he didn't recall doing anything special. Princess Serena laughed. She replied that her brother had said it was thanks to Mr. Karis's words that he was able to find what only he could do, because ever since childhood, Suryu had been compared to his brilliant older brother, the first prince, and Karis's words had been a true salvation for him. And yet Serena asked, had the man really comforted the boy entirely by accident? Karis laughed. In Karis's opinion, it was the most ordinary advice any adult would give. Apparently, Suryu's status and surroundings weighed too heavily on him. After a brief pause, Serena told Karis that, since their business was finished, he'd better hurry back to L'Oreal. After all, the girl realized that for Mr. Karis, making his precious daughter wait was pure torture. Karis replied that she had hit the nail on the head. In Princess Serena's opinion, they certainly still had topics to discuss. But she asked if she could ask him one last question, and the man allowed her to ask. Serena asked Mr. Karis if, even knowing the plot of the game, he would still continue to defend his daughter, who was destined to play the role of the villain. Her expression was quite serious. Karis smiled and said he had already started wondering what she would ask him this time. The man asked the princess if there was a father in the world who wouldn't want his daughter to be happy. The girl replied that anything is possible, of course, and she wouldn't deny it. The environment in which a person grows up, their surroundings, all of this can change them beyond recognition. And yet Karis was certain that his answer would never change. As a father, he would never wish for his daughter's ruin and would do everything in his power to protect her. He wanted L'Oreal to marry the man she loved with all her heart, and for her to one day say with a smile that she was truly happy. Karis made it clear to Serena once again that he simply would not allow his daughter to become a villain. The girl laughed, replied that she understood, and that she had heard him. As she said goodbye, she told Karis that she would look forward to their next conversation. Karis replied to the princess that the feeling was mutual and that he would be grateful if Serena continued to be a friend to his daughter. Serena didn't argue and replied that she would. Just as she was about to leave, the princess remembered something else. Karis tensed up again. Princess Serena politely asked the man to prepare some sweets for her family next time as well. Mr. Karis replied that he didn't mind, but since she remembered her past life, she should at least know how to cook a little. Karis even seemed at a loss for words and spread his hands. The girl sadly lowered her head and replied that, unfortunately, cooking was not her thing at all. The man didn't press her for details or ask her any questions. He simply replied that he understood. Serena explained that, on the other hand, she makes full use of her cheat knowledge when it comes to sewing and needlework. And a brilliant idea came to her mind. In that case, Princess Serena proposed a deal to Mr. Karras. She would sew outfits for his wife and Laurier, and he would make desserts for her. The man was delighted and agreed. But he immediately warned the princess not to expect culinary masterpieces from him because ingredients and food in this world were severely limited. Serena generously replied that the level of their previous tea party would be more than enough. She announced that they had reached an agreement, smiled at the man with her radiant smile, and waved goodbye to him at the door. Karras smiled back and waved to her. But he noticed that their agreement had turned out rather strange. But the man thought that since she really did have such golden hands, then, in his opinion, she shouldn't have any problems with taste either. And if the payment for her wonderful dresses for his beloved girls would be nothing more than his sweets, then it would be quite a profitable deal. Karras couldn't say that the princess herself no longer aroused any fears or suspicions in him at all. But now she no longer seemed like a threat to his family, and that reassured him somewhat. And the fact that he'd formed a connection with someone who knew the plot of this Otome game could be a huge help to him. And yet, Mr. Karras was worried. With Princess Serena's unpredictable temperament, she was probably too difficult for him to deal with, and he would prefer to cross paths with her as rarely as possible, managing the finances of his lands, solving pressing problems. Such paperwork, requiring mental effort, was, in Karras's opinion, truly in the spirit of true aristocracy. Nevertheless, they're also military nobles. If magic existed in this world, the division of roles might be far more complex. But there are no supernatural powers here. Therefore, in this world, administrative aristocrats and military aristocrats serve in distinct roles, each in their own field. Karras takes the ducal house of Full as an example. Originally, they were a family of administrators. In the past, His Majesty even granted them the position of chancellor. On the other hand, there are the military dynasties. They form the backbone of the country's military might, and the post of knight commander is often held by members of ducal houses equal to the House of Full. And now Karras, after his restless and endless stream of thoughts, returns to the main point. He didn't understand why he, a descendant of a family of pure-blooded administrators, would, or rather, why the Karras of the past would be so masterful with a sword. The thing is, Karras had served in this country's knightly order for some time. The story of how he joined it is quite a long one, so he'll tell it another time. And in those glorious days he was nicknamed the Sword Demon. His skill was so extraordinary that he attracted a lot of attention within the order. Karras was amazed at himself and his ability to wield a sword. He struck hundreds of blows without stopping and noticed that he had expended far less energy than expected. The man's gaze was quite anxious, even frightened, because he, having seen swords only in pictures his entire past life, and now finding himself in this body, seriously doubted that he would even be able to hold the blade in his hands. But Karras realized that muscle memory was doing its job. It was as if his body instinctively knew how to move. So this was the power of the man they called the Sword Demon. Several years had passed since he left the order, and now that strength was probably not even half as great as it had been before. But even so, his physical prowess was simply astonishing. Now the man realized that he was in awe of Karras's abilities. A handsome man in the prime of his life, possessing outstanding talents and high status, with a beautiful wife and a charming daughter. Karras wondered how anyone could be so lucky in this life. He just wanted to shout it out to the whole world. However, he understood perfectly well that what looks like happiness from the outside is far from always being happiness for the person themselves. Just then, a cheerful Sasha and Laurier approached the man on the street. They called out to him, and Karras called out to them in response. He guessed that they had been watching him all this time and observing him practicing with his sword. Sasha replied that yes, because Siga told them he was here. Suddenly, little Laurier tugged insistently at her father's shirt tail, because she wanted to tell him something important. Karras asked his daughter, a little anxiously, what was wrong, and she responded by shouting enthusiastically about how cool her father was, closing her eyes in joy. Karras was once again convinced in his mind what an angel his precious daughter was. The man asked if it was true. He warmly thanked her and immediately asked his wife if she had enjoyed it. She shyly folded her arms in front of her and replied, flustered, that her husband Karis had been magnificent. A faint blush spread across her face, and her smile became very bashful. Karis felt very pleased. He was glad to hear such praise from his family. He said he would gladly hug them both, but unfortunately, he was all sweaty from training. The man suggested doing it a little later and smiled. Laurier was startled and worried that her father wouldn't hug her. Karis explained that it wasn't that he didn't want to, but that she probably wouldn't like hugging a sweaty father. The girl shouted back that that wasn't true at all, and she was already sure he wouldn't hug her, so she grew sad. Karis was certain that, of course, he wanted to hug this angel, and since that was the case, he simply had to grant the wish of his little princess. The man picked up his daughter and hugged her, and she laughed happily. At that moment, Sasha suddenly but gently tugged at her husband's arm. Karis was startled. His eyes and his daughter's eyes widened in surprise. Sasha looked down, embarrassed and shy, and quietly said that she wouldn't mind a hug either. Karis realized that his beloved wife had also given her approval and gently wrapped his arms around her shoulders, pulling her close. All three of them were very happy about this. His daughter exclaimed to her father that he was very strong. Karis was flattered, and he noticed that in each hand he held a beautiful flower, symbolizing his lovely ladies. Morning came. Karis sat in the mansion, lost in thought. Yesterday had been a happy day, but today, reality had dealt him a blow, and Mr. Karis was up to his ears in work. His face portrayed some not-so-pleasant emotions, and the morning fatigue was already taking its toll on him. He was indignant about why aristocrats always had so much work, and it wasn't at all because he was being lazy. The duchy's estates were vast, which meant a great many problems were pouring in from all directions, and Karis had to keep all of it under control. To be honest, the man admits himself that he would gladly spend all his free time with his wife and daughter away from work. But it's one thing to be able to work from home. Sometimes, however, his personal presence is simply indispensable, and today was just such a day. He has to settle a few matters that require his personal presence at the royal castle. Karis admits that leaving his sweet Laurier and his beautiful wife Sasha alone at home is very unsettling. But recently, his estate has been guarded by the best of the best, personally selected by Karis, so that no intruder will dare come within a step of the ducal residence. Back when Karis didn't give a damn about his family, he hired servants without much discernment, and because of that, the house was simply teeming with slackers and downright shady characters. Guards with shady pasts, tutors with awful tempers, maids who were always shirking their duties. But Karis ruthlessly swept out all that trash and carried out the most extensive staff purge possible at the estate. And yet, Mr. Karis's anxiety hadn't gone away. That's why he was eager to wrap up all his business as soon as possible and fly home. Karis arrived at the royal palace and went to the meeting. The man was somewhat surprised by Mr. Karis's unexpected appearance. He jokingly exclaimed that he was seeing Duke Full himself and smiled. It had been a long time since they'd seen each other. Karis thought to himself, it's Viscount Grease. He told him he was glad to see him. Karis joked that, given the man's uniform, he should probably address him as Commander of the Knights. Grease laughed it off and replied, adding that if Duke Full were to join their order, he would prefer that the man always address him that way. Right? Karis remembered, this same man is the commander of the knightly order responsible for their country's security, and by aristocratic title, he is the head of the Viscount family, Viscount Grease. Before him, the post of commander of the knightly order had traditionally been held by members of ducal houses, but this sword-wielding genius had managed to earn the recognition of the order's old veterans and rise to his current position. That is who Viscount Grease is. In response to the man's joke, Karis replied that he feared that was out of the question and he would not return to the Order of Knights. In that case, the man said he would still call him Viscount Grease. The man realized that Lord Karis had no intention of returning to him after all. Karis replied that he had already served his time, and now his duty was to serve his country as a duke. Mr. Karis had mountains of paperwork in his hands. Viscount Grease was even surprised and a little upset, and he told Mr. Karis that numerous rumors of the man's countless exploits had reached him. Grease warned Karis that if his mind were to change, He would guarantee him the best conditions and a high-ranking position. He would welcome him back at any time. The men shook hands generously. Karis was flattered by Viscount Grease's invitation, but he fears that such heavy burdens are no longer suitable for his aging body. Besides, Karis has long since stepped away from military affairs and prefers to stay in the shadows. He believes that if such a man were to return to active duty, it would be nothing but a headache for the entire order. Grease disagreed and replied that this was not the case at all. He was certain that many of the current knights of the order would welcome Karis's return with joy. After all, if the legendary sword demon himself were to return to the order, it would be a great inspiration for the young knights, and his old comrades in arms would be overjoyed. Karis scratched the back of his head in embarrassment and told the Viscount that he was clearly overestimating his abilities. That's how he would have answered, based on his own opinion. But if one were to judge Karis objectively, Grease's words hit the mark perfectly. Viscount Grease told him he shouldn't be so modest. Karis had left the front lines only because of the increased burden of being the head of the ducal house. But even so, Karis's skills far surpassed those of the average active knights of the order. However, the man replied honestly to the Viscount that he was sincerely grateful to him for holding him in such high regard. But now he wants to spend more time with his family, his wife and daughter. So he is forced to decline. Grease was truly stunned. Karis was taken aback. The Viscount admitted that he hadn't expected to hear something like that from him, and he realized that the rumors were true. Karis was surprised that there were rumors circulating about him, and the Viscount explained, "Rumor has it that Duke Charisful has recently mended fences with his family. What's more, it seems he's become a different person and has come to love them sincerely." The Viscount mentioned that this is the talk of the town these days. Karis fell deep in thought. The old Karis. Did he really care so little about his own family that even other aristocrats were gossiping about it? Karis laughed, trying not to show it. But he was stunned as well. Suddenly, something began to move behind the Viscount. Karis noticed it and was a little startled. He asked the king anxiously, "Who is hiding behind you?" The Viscount replied that it was his son, Revan Grease, and apologized to the man for the awkwardness. He turned to his son and ordered him to greet the Duke. The boy clasped his hands nervously and fiddled with the bow tie on his shirt. Karis looked at the child and remembered that he had seen him somewhere before. Revan introduced himself quietly and timidly, looking down. And then the Viscount got angry at his son. He shouted at him, saying he had told him many times that one must always greet people loudly and clearly. Revan wanted to say something to his father, but he was afraid. And besides, he wasn't given a chance to speak. The Viscount shouted back that there could be no buts, that Revan was the eldest son of the house of Viscount Grease and in the future would become a knight, a defender of this country. In the Viscount's opinion, he needed to be more confident. Karis was surprised. Well. He watched the Viscount interact with his son and realized that the situation in their family was, of course, quite something. A father whose Spartan upbringing reeks from a mile away, and a son who is utterly downtrodden and lacking in self-confidence. Karis understood that this was, of course, another family's business and he probably shouldn't meddle too much in it. But this boy, Revan, reminded him so much of Laurier from the recent past. The man decided to speak up after all, offering his opinion but first apologizing to the Viscount. He told him that he understood outsiders should interfere but warned him not to intimidate the boy like that. The Viscount didn't understand at first but then replied that, in his opinion, his son was growing up far too weak-willed and that a son of the Grease household simply had to be much more self-assured. Karis realized that just as much as he disliked meddling in other people's child-rearing with his advice, but in this case, he simply had to speak up and he told the man that even if that were the case, he shouldn't put pressure on Revan because every person has their own character. Grease was surprised. Karis continued, saying that, of course, sometimes a strict upbringing like Grease's is necessary. And as a father, he understood perfectly well that the Viscount was doing this out of love for his son. But the man reminded the Viscount that his son was not him. Revan was his own person. So Karis gave Viscount Grease some advice. Just talk to his son more often. Revan stood there, shrinking back in discomfort. And his father was even more surprised by Duke Foal's words. But Duke Foal was certain that this way, Grease and his son would definitely be able to reach a mutual understanding. Karis leaned toward Revan and introduced himself. The child replied quietly again. The man patted him on the head, which startled Revan a little. Karis reassured him that being shy around a stranger was perfectly normal and that his outstanding father was right there beside him, so Revan could stand tall. The boy timidly replied that this was true, but that he didn't have nearly as much talent with a sword as his father did and clenched his hands in uncertainty. Karis kindly replied that, at his age, it was still too early to talk about talent. The man laughed to himself in his mind and noted that he was acting like a know-it-all adult. And yet, Karis told the child that if he lacked talent, he could simply develop it. Revan's eyes filled with surprise. The man asked the boy if he loved his father. The boy timidly replied that he did. And Karis continued, saying that this meant the boy also admired his father. Revan said that he admired his father and wanted to become just like him someday. An outstanding knight. Karis told the boy that in that case, he needed to find his own path and strive to become a knight who would surpass his father. Revan didn't know what his own path meant. Karis said that what his path would be like depended on what he would see and experience in the future. But according to Karis, no matter which path the child took, if he truly wanted to get closer to the father he admired, he simply had to give it his all. And that Grease was so strict with him because he had high hopes for his son. The boy was surprised, but Karis warned him not to take it as a heavy burden, and he asked him to remember that his father loves him very much and wants only the best for him. Little Revan exclaimed that he would try his best and that he was a little scared for now, but he would definitely try to find his own path. Karis stood up straight and replied that that was wonderful, wishing him luck. The man apologized once more to Grease for butting in with his instructions and advice. But he was certain that behind all of Revan's shyness lay a truly strong spirit. The Duke asked the man to believe that his son would become a far more outstanding knight than he could ever imagine. Grease admitted honestly that he was taken aback. He hadn't expected to hear such words from his son. The man ruffled his son's hair and looked at him with pride. Revan didn't know how to react. Karis pointed out that children think about far more things than parents realize. That's why he asked Grease to talk to his son more often. He gave the example of how he chats with his daughter every day and she teaches him a lot. Then Karis said goodbye and was about to leave quickly to finish his business. But then Revan stopped Duke Full. He turned around and saw Revan proudly telling him that he would become just as outstanding a knight as his dad. Karis replied that he would look forward to it and smiled. This happens all the time in families where fathers and children hardly communicate. But what goes on in a child's mind sometimes exceeds any parental expectations. It would seem that parents should understand their children better than anyone else in the world. But often it is the parents who find it hardest to see what matters most. And Karis knew this. He understood that, so he wouldn't lose sight of what really mattered. He had to cherish the time spent with Sasha and Laurier even more than before. And the man made up his mind. He needed to get through this paperwork as quickly as possible and rush home to his beloved family. Karis realizes that there's only a week left until the big day, and he had thought everything through down to the last detail. He was shouting in the kitchen, overcome with emotion, and Sieg even came running at the sound of his cries. Garlic called out to Mr. Karis and reminded him that he had been asked not to shout. The man apologized again in response. Garlic asked the man if he was sure he really wanted to bake the cake himself. And Karis replied that yes, because on a day like this, he simply had to try his best for Laurier's sake. And he has high hopes for Garlic's dishes. The chef told the gentleman that he could count on him. He promised to definitely prepare everything according to the new recipes Mr. Karis had given him. Karis gave Garlic recipes from another world. Dishes from his Japanese memories that children simply adore. Karis was curious to see if Chef Garlic could recreate them using local ingredients. This was a true test of his culinary skills. And Karis is taking on the most important task, the classic cake. Lately, he's been baking sweets quite often, so he's already gotten the hang of it. Laurier has a sweet tooth, so he wanted to bake something extra sweet for her. But then he remembered that his wife, Sasha, doesn't like anything too cloying, and he wasn't sure what to do. Of course, he understood that Laurier was the guest of honor, and it would make more sense to bake a cake to her taste. But he wanted Sasha to enjoy it too. So he thought it over and remembered that Sasha had recently been feeling unwell and had a bit of an upset stomach. At the time, she had told her husband that she really wanted to eat something tart and refreshing. The man was worried about his wife and warned her that if she felt worse, she should tell him right away. She told him that everything was fine, but Karis wanted to make her something that would give her strength. And they decided he would bake a lemon cake for Sasha. And for Laurier, an incredibly sweet one. Karis immediately set about baking a test batch. A little while later, as he was spreading the frosting on the cake, he was really happy and realized it was almost done. Because it was his first time baking a lemon cake and he was terribly nervous about how it would taste. And in his opinion, it turned out quite well. But the problem lay elsewhere. The cake for Laurier. Karis noticed that it looked great on the outside but didn't taste nearly as sweet as he had imagined. He knew something was off with this cake. And out of the blue, a maid burst into the kitchen calling out to Mr. Karis loudly and anxiously. It was Sasha, the personal maid. She reported anxiously that Mrs. Sasha had lost consciousness. The girl explained that at first Sasha had complained to her of nausea and then she had collapsed. Karis immediately rushed to his wife, deeply worried about her condition. He realized that it seemed she had fallen ill after all, and he blamed himself for not having insisted on a thorough medical examination back then. The man prayed that his wife would be all right. After Karis rushed into his wife's room, the doctor, who was sitting next to Sasha's bed and examining her, smiled and shared the happy news. Sasha was pregnant. The woman sat there, smiling gently, and Karis was stunned that his wife was expecting a child. Sasha explained that her recent discomfort had apparently been caused by this very thing. She apologized to her husband for making him worry. Karis hugged her immediately and replied, "Thank God." The woman was surprised. By this point, the doctor had already left, leaving them alone. Karis took Sasha's hands and told her that this was a great blessing and that it was good that she was all right. She thanked him for his sincere concern and tried to get out of bed. But Karis immediately shouted that she absolutely must not get up and that she needed complete rest right now. The woman wanted to disagree with him, but she couldn't. She couldn't go against her husband. So she lay back down. Karis stroked her head and thanked her for carrying a new member of their family under her heart. Sasha blushed, because initially Karis hardly ever spent the night with Sasha. To be more precise, Karis generally kept his distance from women. So after the wedding, nothing happened between them, except for their wedding night. If Karis' parents hadn't pressured him as the eldest son and heir to the duchy, Laurier would probably have been born much later. That's how cold their relationship was. And suddenly, after all that, they were unexpectedly expecting a second child. Karis knew he didn't need to be a prophet to imagine his parents' astonished faces. The man replied to his wife that, whatever the case, this was his and Sasha's precious child. And now, in his opinion, their bond would grow even stronger. Sasha was surprised and asked him to clarify what he meant by bond. And Karis explained that you could even say it was the fruit of their love. He asked his wife which she liked better. Sasha was even more flustered by this description. The fruit of love. The man said that was exactly what it was. The fruit of their love. It was a priceless miracle that would make their bond even stronger. The man stroked his wife's hair. He himself realizes that this sounds incredibly embarrassing, but he had sworn to express his feelings openly. Karis leaned towards Sasha's ear and suggested choosing slightly more specific words. Sasha couldn't take it anymore and let out a cry of embarrassment. But Karis just laughed at her reaction. A few days later, that momentous day finally arrived. Today is Laurier's birthday. Karis had been shouting about it since morning and Sieg and Garlic were in shock over it. However, he was sad that Sasha, unfortunately, wasn't feeling well, so he asked her to stay in bed. Before that, his wife had apologized for it, and Karis wanted her to make a point of not worrying about anything and just resting. He'd like to spend some time with her, but he'll be able to do that after he wishes Laurier a happy birthday. Sieg came to inform Mr. Karras that the young lady's lesson would soon be over. The man replied to the servant that he understood. He went to the study for his daughter's lesson and waited for it to end. The teacher, a young and polite girl, immediately closed the textbook and told her student that their lesson was now over. Laurier turned to the teacher and sincerely thanked her. Karras told his daughter that she had done a great job, but the girl hadn't expected to see her father there. He leaned toward her and asked if her classes were over for the day. She replied that they were and asked about her father's work. The man replied that he had something important to discuss with her, which is why he had finished early today. Laurier was even more surprised. Karras led her to a huge, luxurious closed door and told her that they needed to go in there. Laurier guessed that her father's business was in that room. The man said yes and suggested that the girl open the door herself. She was very happy, and she opened it. A magnificent surprise awaited her behind the door. Beautiful garlands hung everywhere, and the walls and ceiling were decorated with flowers and bright ribbons. Overjoyed, Laurier turned to her father and asked, "What is this?" After all, it was such a beautiful room. Karras told the girl that, as she could see, they had decided to decorate the room to celebrate her birthday. He ruffled her hair and said that actually, her mom had wanted to come and congratulate her with him too, but she wasn't feeling well right now. So Karras suggested that his daughter go see Sasha later. Laurier turned to her father, and with a puzzled look on her face, she asked, "What's a birthday?" Karras was sadly surprised. He realized that she had never had such celebrations before. And the man explained to his daughter that a birthday is a day when they express their gratitude and thank Laurier for coming into the world. Today is the day she was born, which is why they are celebrating. Laurier listened to her father with her eyes wide with surprise. She asked, confused, if he and her mother were happy that she had been born to them. Karras replied that, of course, they were happy, and they were infinitely happy that Laurier had become their daughter along with Sasha. Then the man stood up, took his daughter by the hand, and led her into the room. Two young women were standing in the room. Their names were Mia and Rear. They were maids in the Duke's household. Laurier was pleasantly surprised by their appearance. Karras turned to her and announced that starting next year, they would invite Laurier's friends and throw lavish parties. But this year, they had decided to hold a modest celebration just for those with whom she got along very well. The girl noticed that Mia and Rear were wearing different clothes. Usually, they were dressed in Snow-White maid's aprons and war clothes. But today, they had come dressed up in the most beautiful festive dresses. Karras explained to his daughter that it was because they weren't at work right now. They were guests who had been invited to congratulate Laurier. The girl was very surprised by everything that was happening. She asked her father if Mia and Rear were really going to eat with them, and her father replied that they were. The invited maids leaned toward the birthday girl and told her that it was a great honor for them to congratulate the young lady in such a setting, and they offered her their heartfelt congratulations. In their opinion, she had grown up a lot and become even more beautiful. The girl was genuinely delighted and thanked them for their congratulations. And yet, as Karras looked at them, he realized he had done the right thing by organizing a small, intimate celebration. If he had thrown a grand celebration the very first time, there would have been a sea of problems with the guests, in a man's opinion. And he was afraid that, because of this, Laurier wouldn't be able to have a good time. Then Karras invited everyone to the table. He said that otherwise all the delicious food garlic had prepared would get completely cold. The chef came out to the guests with a huge tray of delicious food. Everyone immediately noticed how appetizing and delicious the food looked. Karras suggested that the birthday girl eat before it got cold. Laurier picked up a fork and began tasting the dishes. She said it was very tasty. Karras was delighted. Laurier turned to her father and exclaimed enthusiastically that it was simply delicious, and suggested he try it himself. Rear turned to the young lady and pointed out her manners. But Karras cut her off and replied that everything was fine. He understood that, as an aristocratic father, he was supposed to scold his daughter for her poor manners. But he asked her to show him the father who would refuse when his beloved daughter was feeding him with a spoon. And he would gladly try it. Laurier fed him the food and asked if it really tasted good. Her father replied that it was incredibly delicious and smiled as he looked at his daughter. He felt that eating together made it taste even better. The girl asked if he really liked eating with her, and the man replied that, of course, he did. Laurier said, laughing, that she also really liked eating with her father. Karis once again noticed that his daughter was very sweet. She was pure charm. However, Laurier grew sad and said that if her mother were with him, it would be even more delicious. Karis told her she was right and said that when Mom woke up, they would all eat cake together. The girl was surprised by the cake and by the fact that her father had made it himself, putting all his love into it. The man told her that he had tried very hard while baking for her and her mom, so he asked his daughter to look forward to the cake. He could see what an angel Laurier was, and yet, Karis was convinced that he was so happy that his Laurier had begun to express her emotions so sincerely. It makes him happy now. But when the girl hits puberty, Karis's heart aches at the thought that one day, Laurier might throw in his face that she hates him. Laurier sat there and noticed her father frowning and looking pensive, worrying about something. So she tugged at his sleeve. She asked him with concern, "What's wrong? Is your stomach hurt?" Karis snapped out of it and replied in a cheerful voice that nothing terrible had happened. He realized he shouldn't act that way because his feelings were written all over his face. He was worried about adolescence, which was still a long way off. Karis realized he still had a lot to learn. One day, Laurier would leave her father's house. To say that Karis wouldn't be sad would be a lie. But for the sake of his child's happiness, he was ready to let go of her hand with joy. Karis turned to his daughter. He took her hand and told her that no matter what happened, he would always be her father, so she could feel free to be herself and do whatever she wanted. Karis continued and said that no matter what happened, he would always be on her side because she was his and Sasha's most precious daughter. Laurier didn't understand her father's sincere words because of her young age, but then she immediately cheered up and laughed at him. The man smiled and realized that it seemed the girl hadn't fully grasped the meaning of his words herself. He still had a lot to learn as a father. But for now, Karis was certain he would do everything in his power and watch Laurier grow with love. And at the same time, he understood that he needed to keep himself in check so as not to turn into an overly intrusive and overprotective dad. Karis urged Laurier to eat more at the table and fed her. The girl was happy. Karis asked Laurier firmly, "Are you ready?" The girl replied that she was ready. They approached the door to Sasha's room. Karis knocked gently and quietly at the door. They opened the door and Karis asked Sasha if she was asleep. The woman let them in. The man asked how she was feeling. Sasha was sitting on the bed and said she was fine. She was feeling much better now than she had been that morning. Laurier ran up to her mother and asked if she was really feeling better. Sasha was delighted to see her daughter, and she sincerely apologized for making her worry. The woman said she had really wanted to celebrate Laurier's birthday with him and sadly lowered her head. The girl took her mother's hands and spoke to her. She said that the most important thing was for her mother to be healthy. Laurier asked her to get plenty of rest and get well soon. Sasha thanked her for her kind words. Karis watched them and noticed just how kind Laurier was. How lovely. The man felt there was no better word to describe this scene. He realized that this was exactly what paradise looked like, where goddesses and little angels dwelled. He remembered and almost forgot why they were there and cleared his throat. The man asked Sasha if she had an appetite. Sasha thought for a moment and replied that she could only eat something light and refreshing right now. Just a little. Karis was delighted and said that his treat for today would be just what his wife needed. Sasha looked at him in surprise and a broad, happy smile spread across Laurier's face. Karis brought a tray with a cake and a pie into the room, and he presented his creations to the family. He explained that for Sasha, he had prepared a cake with the perfect balance of lemony tartness and sweetness, and for Laurier a sweet strawberry shortcake. Surprised, Sasha asked her husband if the holiday wasn't over yet and what did all this mean. Karis replied that the four of them had already had dinner together, along with Mia and Rear. But he said that today was such an important day, Laurier's birthday, and he had saved the main cake so that the three of them could eat it together as a family. Sasha sadly noted how much effort he had gone to for her sake and said she felt very awkward. Karis remembered that Laurier had said how much she wanted to eat this cake with her mother. And the girl confirmed these words and exclaimed that she wanted to eat the cake with her mother. Sasha was pleasantly shocked. Karis asked his wife for her opinion. Sasha hugged her daughter and thanked her for everything. Meanwhile, Karis went to set the table for them and asked the family to wait a moment. The woman was surprised that her husband wanted to set the table himself. He cut the cakes into individual slices, placed them on everyone's plates, handed out forks, and did everything very neatly. Sasha said that it all looked simply gorgeous. Karis agreed with her. The man took a forkful of cake, turned to his wife, and asked her to open her mouth. Sasha was very embarrassed. Karis didn't give up and asked her not to be shy, but she still refused. Laurier also made her open her mouth and push her hand. She kept saying how delicious it was. And then Sasha couldn't take it anymore and finally opened her mouth. Karis shoved a forkful of cake in her mouth and was very happy. And she replied that it was insanely delicious. Laurier tugged at her father's shirt sleeve and asked him to feed her too, pointing her finger at her mouth. Meanwhile, Sasha covered her mouth with her hand and stepped back, embarrassed. Karis turned to his daughter, picked up a fork, and asked her to open her mouth. The girl opened her mouth and took a bite of cake, just like a baby bird. Sasha laughed and Laurier said it tasted really good. Suddenly, the girl pointed at her mom and declared that she had already finished the cake, but her mother hadn't yet. The woman looked at everyone shyly again. Karis was surprised at how quickly his daughter had eaten the cake and asked his wife to open her mouth again. Sasha replied that she could eat on her own. But Laurier and Karis wouldn't let up and asked her to open her mouth again. After they had all eaten together, the ladies thanked the man for the treat. Karis asked them if they liked his creation. They told him it was very tasty. And the man left the room because he remembered something. But he immediately came back in with a large box in his hands, tied with a festive ribbon, and turned to Laurier. It was her gift. The girl asked her father, "What is it?" And he asked her to open it and take a look. After the girl untied the ribbon on the box. Inside was a large, fluffy stuffed animal that looked like a little sheep. Laurier immediately exclaimed how cute the gift her father had given her was. Karis explained with a smile that he had asked a friend to teach him how to sew, and he had made this stuffed animal himself. He asked if she liked it. Laurier picked up the toy and was very surprised. Her mouth agape. Sasha, seeing the toy, was also surprised and asked her husband if he had really sewn it himself. Karis understood their surprise perfectly. Thanks to the guidance of that same friend, even he, a complete novice at needlework, managed to finish it just in time for today. The man said that, after all, today was Laurier's birthday, and he wanted to give her something to remember it by. So he decided to sew this. After that, he immediately asked the birthday girl for her opinion. Laurier expressed her immense gratitude to her father and, hugging the toy, said she would cherish it very, very much. Karis replied, "Thank goodness," and said he was very happy that his daughter liked it. To be honest, the man admitted that it was his first time sewing and he was terribly nervous, but seeing Laurier so happy, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. The girl showed her toy to her mother up close and asked her to look at this wonderful gift. The woman replied that she was very happy for her and that the gift was truly beautiful. Karis was sure that her joy was worth all his efforts. Suddenly, Sasha looked strange and confused. Karis noticed this and asked her what was wrong. Was she feeling unwell? She replied that it wasn't that. She explained that she had been thinking that she too should give Laurier a birthday present, specifically something she had made herself. Karis took her hands and kindly replied that it was no big deal and that next year they would definitely prepare a gift for her together. Sasha told her husband that she was taking him at his word. Suddenly, Karis asked his wife to close her eyes for a moment and not open them until he said so. The woman was very surprised but didn't resist. The man reached for her hair. A few minutes later, he let her know she could open her eyes. A beautiful hair clip with flowers appeared in her hair right behind her ear. Sasha was touched by its beauty. Karis explained that his wife's birthday was still a long way off. Of course, but this gift was especially for her as a token of his daily gratitude. She immediately thanked her dear husband and promised that she would always cherish this hair clip. For Sasha, birthdays had also become a distant and forgotten thing. To be more precise, ever since she got married and entered the full household, Karis had never once wished her a happy birthday. But now there was a new Karis, and he had made a promise to himself that he would congratulate her, pouring all the love she had been deprived of all these years into every birthday greeting. Suddenly, Laurier spotted the hairpin and turned to her mother. She asked happily if her father had given her this gift. Sasha replied that he had and asked her daughter if it suited her. Laurier exclaimed that it suited her perfectly. Karis listened to them and realized that the level of cuteness was off the charts. He noticed what a wonderful and loving atmosphere they had. Laurier turned to her father. She told him that when it was his birthday, they would throw him a big party too. Sasha added in a cheerful voice that she would try her best too. And Laurier was already about to ask Garlic to teach her how to cook so she could bake a cake for her father herself. Karis was stunned and lost for words. But then he replied that he would look forward to that day. He was sure that from now on, his birthday would become one of the most important family holidays for him. Sasha and Laurier turned to Karis and warmly thanked him. The man realized that, after all, kindness would save the world. The next day arrived. Karis thought about it and realized that yesterday had been simply wonderful. He was sitting in his office, busy with his work. Suddenly, he heard a knock on his door. Sieg entered and apologized for the disturbance. Karis asked the servant what was going on. Sieg told Mr. Karis that he had something to tell him. The servant placed a letter sealed with wax on Mr. Karis' desk and said it had arrived just a short while ago. The man recognized the letter and he realized that his father and mother were coming to visit them. Sieg confirmed that, yes, indeed, Mr. Oscar and Mrs. Rihanna would be arriving here soon. The former Duke Oscar Fall and his wife, Duchess Rihanna Fall, Karis' parents. As far as he could recall, since retiring from public life, they had been living quietly on one of their estates. But Karis couldn't understand why they had decided to pay a visit right now, and he immediately thought that they had found out about Sasha's pregnancy. But the fact was that Karis hadn't told them about it, which meant the circle of suspects narrowed down to one person. Mr. Karis asked Sieg if he reported everything regularly to his father and mother. Sieg replied that they had asked him and he had simply answered all their questions. Karis wasn't in a very good mood and he didn't know what to do now. Sasha, Laurier, and all the servants in the mansion welcomed the positive changes in his personality with open arms. But he didn't know how his parents, who hadn't seen Karis in so many years, would take it. Judging by old Karis memories, his parents weren't bad people. He would even say they were normal. However, because of that Karis' difficult temperament, he had almost no memory of normal conversations with his parents and certainly none after the wedding. They constantly asked when he and Sasha would have children. All they did was pressure him for heirs. At the time, that Karis constantly made excuses about being busy with the Order of Knights and the affairs of the ducal house. He also claimed that he and Sasha weren't very compatible, so it was difficult for them to have a child. Of course, Karis really was up to his ears in work. But Karis himself simply wasn't interested in women. Or rather, he avoided them. And that was the main reason for his estrangement from Sasha. But it's one thing to dislike women in general and quite another when it comes to Sasha. The new Karis couldn't understand at all how he could have neglected such a charming and devoted wife. And in any case, Karis now realized that it didn't matter. He turned to Sieg and asked for his opinion. How do you think his father and mother would react when they saw him now? Sieg smiled and admitted that, frankly speaking, they would be moved to tears. Karis fell on a thought. Could it really be that Karis, who simply loved his wife and daughter, would elicit such a passionate reaction? The man waved goodbye to his servant Sieg and ordered him to prepare everything necessary for his parents' arrival. As for himself, he wanted to discuss this with Sasha and Laurier first. Sieg bowed to him, obeyed, and left the study. A short while later, the man told his family about his parents' visit. Sasha was surprised that her father and mother were coming to see them. Karis suspected that Sieg had already let everything slip, and he shared these concerns with the family. The man turned to his daughter and told her with a smile that she had seen them only once in her life, and that was at her birth, so she probably didn't remember them at all. The girl guessed that they were her father's parents. Karis replied that this was true and told her that to her, they were her grandparents. Sasha added that these were the people she should always call grandma and grandpa. The woman turned to her husband and said with a worried look that she would at least like to prepare for their arrival. But Karis warned her and reminded her that she mustn't overexert herself, because this is a very important time for her. Sasha apologized to her husband and said she felt very awkward about having to lie in bed all day. Karis replied that no, it was their fault because they were always fussing over her. He added that his wife shouldn't worry about it and turned to Laurier. Laurier agreed with her father. She exclaimed that she was just happy to be with her mother. Karis noted that knowing Sasha's temperament, telling her not to worry was essentially the same as saying nothing at all. The man reminded her that right now, she was working for the sake of their future child, the new member of their family. And he, in turn, was doing everything in his power for her, Laurier, and the baby. Karis gently touched his wife's belly, which had already grown noticeably. He said in a gentle voice that helping each other in a family was perfectly natural. But Sasha replied that she was always causing them so much trouble. Karis took Sasha's hand and wanted to dispel those thoughts from her mind. He looked into her eyes and said that when it came to his beloved wife and daughter, the concept of trouble ceased to exist for him. And even if there were troubles, he would accept them gladly. Karis was firmly convinced that, for the sake of his wife and daughter, he was ready for anything. Sasha's eyes widened. She wanted to say something to him, but the man kissed his wife on the forehead, and she remained silent. Karis finished his thought and added that if she kept saying such sweet nonsense, he would have to silence her with a grown-up kiss. And he asked if she understood everything. The woman blushed and wanted her husband to stop saying such things. Then Laurier turned to them. With a curious look on her face, she asked her father, "What is a grown-up kiss?" This time Karis was the one who blushed, and he told his little daughter that it didn't mean anything like that and asked her to forget it. He realized he needed to watch his language. Time flew by unnoticed, and the day of his parents' arrival had finally come. Karis ordered Sieg to have his parents stay in that bright room in the West Wing. The servant listened to his master's instructions and obediently carried them out. In Mr. Karis's opinion, the maids and gardeners were already doing an excellent job with the daily cleaning and garden maintenance. Karis and Laurier were having tea together at that moment. Suddenly, his daughter turned to her father, cup in hand, and asked, "What are Grandma and Grandpa like?" Karis paused to think. What were they like? After all, he himself knew about them only from the memories of the former Karis, so he didn't even know how to answer Laurier. But he found the words and told his daughter that her grandparents were very kind and noble people. The girl assumed that they were just as kind as her father. Karis was touched that his own little daughter considered him the epitome of kindness. And for him, as a father, there was no greater joy than this. So he told her that was exactly right. The man looked at his reflection in the teacup and smiled to himself. Karis told her that he didn't know how kind he was, but that her grandfather was an outstanding man who always put family first. And Karis himself also strove to be someone who put Laurier, her mother, and everyone in this house above all else. The girl exclaimed to her father with delight that he was very kind. And the man thanked his daughter for her words. Suddenly, one of the maids approached them. She addressed Mr. Karis and informed him that Mr. Oscar and Mrs. Rihanna had arrived. Karis heard this and immediately suggested that Laurier go meet them. The girl waved her arms and happily ran toward them with her father. The man greeted his parents and remarked that it had been a long time since they'd seen each other. He waved to his father and mother. Mrs. Rihanna replied that it had been a long time since they'd seen each other and that she was glad to see her son in good health. But Karis didn't understand why they looked so taken aback. He smiled at them and replied that he was also glad to see them doing well. Little Laurier was standing behind him, and Karis turned to her so she could say hello to her grandparents. The girl stepped out from behind her father's back, curtsied, bowed, and greeted them politely. Mrs. Rihanna was touched and exclaimed that she had only seen her at birth, that so much time had passed, and that she had grown so much. Mr. Oscar was also moved. Karis turned to him and said they hadn't seen each other in a long time, but Mr. Oscar asked his son if it was really him. Karis, not wanting to give anything away, replied as if nothing were wrong, saying it was him, and asked what was wrong. But the man didn't make much of it and still said that everything was fine. He explained that they simply hadn't seen each other in a long time, and he was surprised at how much his son's face had softened. Well, yes, the current Karis remembered that the past Karis had always looked at his parents like a wolf, so it wasn't surprising to him that his father was in shock. He replied to his father, patting his daughter on the head, that when a man starts a family he changes, and he asked if it hadn't been the same for his father. Mr. Oscar replied, flustered, that yes, probably it had. Karis remarked that they must be very tired from the journey and promised to order tea for them right away. Mrs. Rihanna said they didn't need tea right now because she wanted to say hello to Sasha first. The woman realized that this meant Laurier had already learned the dance. She praised her, patted her on the head, and said that this was exactly what she had expected from her granddaughter. Karis noticed how quickly Laurier and his mother had hit it off. But Mr. Oscar looked at his son with distrust and apprehension. In Karis's memory, his mother rarely smiled so sincerely, and he realized that Laurier's charm had apparently melted her heart as well. The parents noticed that the home's decor had changed significantly. There were far more flowers, and they praised Sasha for her efforts. Mr. Oscar sternly asked Karis how his relationship with Sasha was going. The man answered honestly that there had been a time when, because of him, they had both nearly become unhappy, but now he loved them with all his heart. His father was still surprised by his son's behavior and didn't recognize him. When someone you love comes along, the world around you is transformed, and Karis was sure he was right. He asked his father how things had been between him and his mother. Mr. Oscar was stunned. Karis reminded him that he had never heard their story, so he asked him to tell it if the man didn't mind. Mr. Oscar was taken aback and fell into thought. Mrs. Rihanna approached them and sternly asked what they were whispering about. Karis answered honestly that he had been asking his father about their love story, and he asked his mother how things had started between her and his father. Mrs. Rihanna replied indignantly that she hadn't expected such a question from her son, and that she was simply stunned. Karis was surprised that they were so shocked, and he laughed so as not to give himself away. He explained that he had simply thought their love story with his father would serve as a good example for him. But the man immediately realized he'd be better off asking about it later. The four of them approached Sasha's door. Karis knocked politely on it and asked if she was awake. She wasn't asleep and greeted her father and mother. Mrs. Rihanna had let her stay in bed and not get up. She had been told that Sasha wasn't feeling well, but she hadn't thought it was that serious. Sasha began to explain that things were better than she thought. Karis kept his daughter close and asked his wife with concern how she was feeling. She thanked him and replied that she had slept a little and was feeling better. With a sad look on her face, she apologized to her father and mother for meeting them in this state. Karis turned to his wife and warned her that she didn't have to put up with this, and he certainly wouldn't let her overexert herself in his presence. Sasha replied, worried that her father and mother had come to visit, and she couldn't just lie in bed. But Karis leaned toward her and looked his wife in the eyes. He assured her that he could see right through her when she was pushing herself too hard. Her parents watched them and were even more stunned. Karis told her that he knew his Sasha better than anyone else in the world, and in his opinion, they could say hello later when she felt better. Right now, the most important thing was to take care of her health. Sasha wanted to say something, but her parents stood there in shock. Karis warned his wife that if she continued to be stubborn, he would have to use that very thing. But Sasha didn't want that right now, and with a sad look, she replied to her husband that she understood him. The man turned to her parents, asked for their forgiveness, and explained that Sasha's condition hadn't stabilized yet. He asked them if it would be all right if she greeted them properly a little later. His mother's face was filled with confusion. Karis noticed this and asked her what was wrong. She replied, flustered, that nothing was wrong. She was just surprised at how close her son and his wife had become. Karis laughed and explained that he had simply become more honest with himself. But in his mind, Karis realized that his parents thought he was lying to them. Then again, if he were in their shoes, he would have thought the same thing. The man told his father and mother that their belongings had already been taken to their rooms, and that if they needed anything else, they could just tell the maids. Mr. Oscar replied that he understood, but Mrs. Rihanna fell deep in thought and stared into space. She turned to Karis and asked him to step aside for a moment. They stepped out into the hallway to talk. Mr. Oscar agreed to watch over Laurier for the moment. They left and closed the door behind them. Karis began to worry and wondered if his mother didn't like something in the house or if something had happened. He asked her if there were any problems. She replied, flustered, that that wasn't it. The woman realized there was no need to beat around the bush, and she declared that she would ask directly. Mrs. Rihanna stood in front of her son and asked firmly, "Is it true, Karis?" And the man realized that he was being asked this question again. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.